Today is the perfect day to put on our serious hats and talk about serious stuff that matters. Is cereal a soup? Let's get into it. Quite simply, a soup has two fundamental requirements. Number one, solid food ingredients heated in a liquid broth to cook or extract nutrients and flavors into said broth. And number two, the second requirement, is the retention of said broth with the food ingredients to be served with the meal. That's it. It's very simple. Any food that we wish to binarily categorize as soup or not soup can be quickly and efficiently evaluated solely by these two unambiguous rules. Now, astute listeners who consult additional sources, like Wikipedia, may discover a slight discrepancy between my rule number one and some conventional definitions of soup. While all soups must be served within their broth, rule number two, some may classify the need to cook the food ingredients in said broth to be a requirement only for a subset of soups, known as hot soups, and that other soups do not necessarily require cooking of the solid ingredients. I fervently disagree. When we remove the necessity of cooking the ingredients, we permit all sorts of inane nonsense into the soup category that clearly does not belong there, like boba tea, salad with a bit too much dressing, fondue, blended ice creams that have become slightly melty, like the Blizzard or the McFlurry, and the last few pieces of mushy mango that have been sitting in the bottom of the fruit salad container for the last week or so. No, at best, these dishes are suspensions, not soups. It is clear that in order to preserve some modicum of world order, the definition of soup practically requires that rule number one be written to specifically include the cooking of the solid ingredients within the broth. However, cold soups are still permitted. They must simply be cooked first and then chilled prior to serving. Easy. Nonetheless, there are a few dishes that require a little bit of extra clarification or consideration before we can clearly categorize them as soup or not soup. For example, tea. Tea is boiled in water, which is used to extract flavors and nutrients. However, tea violates rule number one in that the leaves and sticks and other such foliage are not food ingredients, and they are not, at least intentionally, consumed. At best, we could argue that tea is a broth, since it contains the flavors and nutrients extracted from said foliage. See, this is very easy. Well, what about oatmeal? Oatmeal is a special type of cereal in which the oats are heated within the water or milk prior to serving. While this does indeed sound like soup, we must also consider whether those oats are being cooked in the broth or just reheated. In the case of instant oatmeal, for example, the oats have already been cooked during processing. Less processed oatmeal, sometimes called steel-cut oats, are arguably only cooked when heated in the broth by the consumer. Nonetheless, I think we can claim, albeit a bit subjectively, that this difference is relatively trivial. Because the broth temperatures applied to reheat or cook the oatmeal are typically substantial, often reaching boiling temperatures that could conceivably use to actually cook things, I decree that oatmeal is indeed a soup. What about gazpacho? I didn't even know what that was until I started writing this episode. But you know how I zealously pushed for the requirement that solid ingredients have to be cooked in order to make a soup? Now, gazpacho is colloquially defined as a soup, yet the vegetables contained within it are raw. Now, there are two possible solutions to this conundrum. First, we may decide to make gazpacho an exception to rule number one. All rules have exceptions, after all. Alternatively, we may simply decide that common wisdom is wrong, and that gazpacho is in fact not soup. This is my vote. Let's talk about pasta for a few seconds. Although pasta is typically cooked by boiling in water, or broth, because the water is discarded prior to serving, pasta is not a soup. Pasta therefore violates rule number two. Of course, if you retain the water in your instant ramen noodles, then it is indeed soup. And if you don't, first, why don't you? And second, then it is not soup. Easy. A quick point about stews. Does the viscosity matter? Short answer, yes. For example, if your oatmeal soaks up all of the broth, leaving very little behind, then it is no longer a soup. Instead, it is a stew, or to be more technical, a slurry. Does the size of the solid food ingredients or particles matter? Short answer, also yes. The math used to derive the minimum threshold for soup particle size is beyond the scope of this talk. But in general, if the particles are too small, the dish will instead be a suspension. Now to answer the original question, is cereal a soup? By now it should be obvious. We can see that cereal violates rule number 1. While cereals are served within a liquid broth, typically cow juice or plant-based analogs of it, the liquid does not serve to cook or extract nutrients from the solid cereal grains. Ah, but cereal does flavor the milk, you might claim. Indeed it does. But this is more of a happy accident and not really the intent of the process. Furthermore, unlike oatmeal, cereals are not cooked within the broth, or milk, within which they are served. Cold cereals clearly violate rule number 1 and are thus definitively categorized as not soup. But is a hot dog a taco?